Thank you all for joining us today. For those that don't know me, my name is Matt Cotty, and I have the privilege of being the Director of Development for Revolutionary Spaces. As some of our closest members, I'm sure you've all heard by now that we are the brand new cultural organization in Boston, formed by the merger of the Bostonian Society and the Old South Association. Through a wide range of dynamic programs and community partnerships, we bring people together to explore the history of and continue the work of democracy that is so singularly evoked by the two national treasures we care for and interpret, the Old State House and Old South Meeting House. I'm incredibly excited to be part of the Revolutionary Spaces team and be working with such a dedicated staff who've been working hard over the last few weeks to transform our programming and our fundraising efforts into the virtual world, adapting so we can still carry out our mission while adhering to physical distancing guidelines. Before we get into the program today, I wanted to first say thank you all for being members of Revolutionary Spaces. We know that these times are uncertain, but I want to assure you that we are thinking of you and are working hard to add value to your membership even while our buildings are closed. The Revolutionary Spaces team have been and will continue to host conversations and virtual events, so please stay on the lookout for email invitations and social media posts for future events. We'll also be in communication once our sites reopen, offering an extension on your membership so you'll be able to come visit our sites and explore this history with us in person. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our membership coordinator, Rosalie Wilbur.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today. As many of you know, this is our first member event for Revolutionary Spaces. And I wanted this to serve as an introduction to the historic sites that this organization cares for, now that you are formally members of both. However, as most of you are very well versed in the history of Boston, rather than focusing on the iconic moments or kind of broad historic overview, instead we're going to discuss the lesser known side of the Old South Meeting House and the Old State House. Sharing their knowledge with us today are President and CEO of Revolutionary Spaces, Nat Sheidley, and Director of Public and Community Programs, Lindamood. I have a number of questions I'm excited to ask you two about, and you'll also have the opportunity to answer questions from our members as well. For those of you who would like to ask questions, please remember we'll be using that chat function, and I will ask them as they come up. To get things started, in kind of classic member events fashion, I wanted to ask the two of you about some behind the scenes things. Most of the time when we do member events, we will visit maybe behind the scenes look at an organization or maybe a special exhibit, but these kind of hidden spaces have always been present. And I was wondering if you two could speak a bit about those kind of hidden historical spaces that would have been present in the past. Erica, why don't you start with a bit about Old South Meeting House?
Sure. So one of my favorite things that I learned about early in my time working at Old South Meeting House was I started working there in the spring of 2012, and later that fall we did a member tour that was a steeple tour, and several members of the staff each basically took on one aspect of the steeple to kind of do a little short talk on. And the one that I got, I don't remember how we divvied these things up, but the one I ended up getting was the Thomas Prince Library. It was really cool because, I mean, people kind of know, there's a clock that you can see on the steeple, and I love the clock. It's very visible, and people talk about it a lot. And then there's the bell, and so I got to learn about all the various bell history as well. But the library it hasn't existed for a long time, and even just to find out what exactly it was, it's a whole process of discovery. So Thomas Prince was a minister, one of the early ministers at the Old South Church, or Old South Meeting House. And so he was a minister for about 40 years. And during his time as minister, he basically had a study in the, not actually, the time overlapped. I'm trying to memorize all the dates and I haven't quite gotten them all memorized, but he had a study in the steeple. So if you're walking up, if you're going up the winding stairs, the first level you get to, there's nothing there. Now, I mean, it's fairly empty. And that's the level where there was this, he had a study in the library, with manuscripts lining the walls, apparently. So he had all different types of books and manuscripts there. The most famous thing that he had there, and there's a whole complicated story around this manuscript and its life, was the Bradford manuscript, which was Governor William Bradford's handwritten history of the Plymouth colony from 1608 to 1647. And Thomas Prince put this in the library. I think he originally borrowed it in 1728 and then was able to deposit it in his library in the steeple at Old South Meeting House sometime during the 1750s. It was there until sometime, I believe, during the Revolutionary War, and after the war, or after the British occupation of Boston, it was discovered to be missing. And of course, there were, I'm sure, lots of stories and rumors about where it had gone, but nobody really confirmed for a long time where it actually ended up. And it was assumed to have been lost, to be perhaps that the British had burned it, or, the soldiers had burned it, or it had been somehow lost. So it turned up in London in the 1840s or 1850s. I think in 1855, that's what I've got here. And between 1855 and 1897, there was this whole complicated back and forth discussion about where it should go, and Boston wanted it back. It is now finally was sent to the State House Library, where it is today, and you can see this manuscript by visiting, or also read it online. And you can get more information at the website of the State Library of Massachusetts on that. Yeah, so it's really just so cool I remember being, like, people were just, standing there at that level, and everyone was just kind of really taken that there was a library, that this was a living, like, working place, and that to try to imagine that being in that space with it being basically empty is pretty cool.
I love that story, Erica, and having been up in the tower, up in the steeple a few times, it is definitely one of those places that challenges your imagination when you stand there and you're like, there was a library here. It is not a logical place to put somebody's library. So it's great to imagine Thomas Prince there, rifling through the manuscripts and books. It's a great story. And it actually reminds me of one of the definitely historic behind the scenes places in the old State House, because this place doesn't exist anymore, but it's similar in nature to the library in Old South Meeting House. And that's the fact that the old State House used to contain the colony's archives. So during the 18th century, so the building was built in 1713 as the seat of government for the province of Massachusetts, and all of the colony's records, the official records of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were kept in the townhouse, as it was called at that time. And where did they keep them? They kept them in like little closets behind the stairs. So the stairs, now if you go into the old State House, one of the defining architectural features is the central spiral staircase that goes up to the second floor where the government chambers were. And there's currently 2 chambers and a rotunda up on the second floor. But in the period before 1830, the building had 3 chambers up on the second floor, and it had foyers between each of those chambers and staircases coming down to the entry level from the foyer. So there were 2 staircases, and behind the staircases, all of the colony's records were kept. And you know, if you're a historian of Massachusetts or a historian of early America at all, you probably know that one of the frustrating things about working on early Massachusetts is that many of the records have been destroyed, and they were destroyed because there was a terrible fire in the townhouse in 1747, and it happened in the middle of the night. There were, embers from a fire that had not been effectively banked at night. And before people realized it, the building was in flames, and the whole town turned out and started running into the townhouse to try to save what couldn't otherwise be preserved. And they made some peculiar choices, like they ran up to the second floor and grabbed the portrait of Queen Anne and ran down with that, but they left many of the records. And in fact, for some of the early period of Massachusetts, the only reason we have any records at all, any official records at all, is because Thomas Hutchinson, who would later become the anti-hero of the story of the Revolution, spent a lot of time going through those records when they still existed and writing a 3-volume history of Massachusetts. So there was a library in Old South Meeting House, and there was an archive and manuscript repository in the townhouse, which I love. The other behind the scene place that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, it just because my office used to be on the 3rd floor of the townhouse, is what exactly was up above those government spaces on the 2nd floor. So up on the 3rd floor, there are all these dormer windows and little nooks and crannies, and today it's curatorial space for our staff. But in the 18th century, that was where the small army of clerks who had to write everything in triplicate did their work. And you can imagine how hot and uncomfortable it must have been during the summer months. They were out there copying everything over and over.
I don't know if I've ever been up there, so that is a very cool little bit of fact for me. And I'll have to now one day, I think.
Yeah, well, there's very little that would cue it historically today, because it's been completely refit to look like modern office space, and there's HVAC venting going through. But you can imagine. And the nice thing is that the windows look out these dormers, and you can see those dormers in 18th century engravings in the building. Like there's a Paul Revere engraving of the townhouse, and so you can make the connection.
Thinking of historic spaces where you can kind of feel that connection to the past. I think a lot of times that's one of the best moments, when you walk into a historic space and you can feel the echoes of people who have come before you. And most of the time what defines a historic space, I think, for a lot of us is that something very iconic happened there. Whether it's the Tea Party debates at Old South, or if it's the reading of the Declaration of Independence from that balcony, those big kind of moments. Are there other small moments or small little connections that you guys have just from being in the buildings for a while that have kind of brought that kind of closeness that you feel a lot? Nat, why don't you head this one off first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, the emotional connection comes from being able to imagine the people in the past who occupied those spaces and whose lives were defined by the encounter with those spaces. So for me, I often feel most moved when I take people, or even in my private moments when I go up alone to the top of the tower. So if you go up in the tower of the old State House, there's a big landing. You can look out these big windows down State Street toward Long Wharf and Boston Harbor. And that's kind of cool because you can imagine that was just the view that people were seeing, 250 years ago. But if you keep going up there, you can go way up to the tippy top. There's only room on the landing for 1 or 2 people. And if you look up there, you're really close to the structure of the tower itself. And there are, because of that 1747 fire, the tower was rebuilt in 1748, but you're really close to the original 1748 timbers of the structure of the cupola. And I love that you can look up and see the maker's marks on them. And those marks relate to the way the thing was built, right? So people didn't like hang way up, and this was the highest spot in Boston at one point. People didn't hang up there and like do the joinery and figure it out. They figured it out on the ground. They got it all set up the way they wanted, and then they took it apart and rebuilt it up on top, knowing that everything would fit together correctly. But to do that, they had to mark each piece in order. And so you can see there's the sills of the cupola, and then there's these 2 beams that go across in an X, and each of them has a mark on it. You can count them all, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and on and on. It's the number 7 where you can see it most clearly. You can see the hash marks that the maker put on them to mark it as number 7. And to me, that's really powerful because while it's not uncommon to see a signed work of an 18th century painter, or even a fine furniture maker might have marked their name on the underside of a chair or a table, it's really uncommon to see the mark of those who did the rougher trades, so the joiners and the carpenters. And so here you can feel the touch of the person whose daily life was in the trade of building stuff in the 18th century. And here it is all these years later, connecting us across all these years to their experience as somebody who went about daily life in Boston. So to me, that's really moving.
Any similar experiences, Erica?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking, Nat, about that we have at the Old South Meeting House, there is something that seems to be kind of similar to that, which is at the top of the steps that lead to the balcony seating area. So the lower level balcony, there's some what seems to be 1 or more signatures of people who are working on the building in, I think it was maybe in the 1890s. Do you remember, Rosalie? Because there's a date, there's definitely a signature and a date there.
It is
definitely
more
more
than
recent.
I expected when I first saw it. So that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a side note. I think that's kind of something a little similar. But in terms of a spot in the building that has that special resonance for me personally, it would have to be this stairway that leads from the first to the second balcony, which is kind of famous for being the only visible architectural feature on the inside of the building that we know dates to the building's construction and completion in 1729. And the thing about that stairwell that, aside from just knowing that it's that old, which is cool, but there's a real sense of personal connection. We talk so much about Phyllis Wheatley and her life and how much of her life she spent in that building. And since she was enslaved, and we presume that her seating would have been up in the second balcony, I don't know, because I don't know exactly where she sat, and I don't know exactly how the stairwells were arranged then, but I figured that there's a pretty good chance she would have walked up and down those steps, every Sunday. And that's a pretty amazing kind of thing to kind of connect, to be able to connect with a person in that kind of way, with that feature.
Yeah, feeling your feet fall like on the same spots, right? That's a neat thing.
And although I think it's not always the case, I almost feel like because it might be that only remnant, it does feel that much more powerful. You get that extra special level.
Yeah, that is a feature of both buildings, right? They both, like any building, right? They're machines that need to be updated over time, and they all bear the marks of so many restorations. We always have visitors come in and they're like, "Are these the original floorboards?" Sorry, they're not, but it makes it that much more powerful when you can see through and see the thing. So there's actually in the old State House, in the entry room, there's a place where we, after a preservation project, just kept open a piece of the ceiling with a piece of plexiglass so you could look through it and see the beam up there, because that beam is an 18th century beam, but everything else that you can see is not. But it does, you're right, it makes it feel really special to get those little glimpses.
I'm a little disappointed I didn't get to see that. So maybe we'll have to revisit that again sometime.
Totally. When we can go back to the buildings.
I think after asking you something that's more emotional, maybe a little more heavy, I'm required to ask you something a little more lighthearted now. I think much like the question of originality, one of the things that I think all historic sites experience, question that I know I've gotten at least a couple times, ghosts. Have you guys ever encountered any tales or remnants of something maybe a little more tangible that wasn't quite what you expected to find? And Erica, why don't you, I know you have some stories about it.
Yes. So I don't know exactly who trained me this way, but I tend to use the term spirits. I don't know, maybe because it just feels more respectful. So I'll use spirits. Yeah. So, well, we actually had, and it's interesting to me that people don't seem to talk about this more than they do, but I mean, because it was a public, it was publicly discussed at the time, but back in, I'm trying to think what year it was, approximately, I can estimate, I would say somewhere around 2013, 2014, we had this team approached us. They were going around and spending nights in different old buildings to do recordings and see whether there were spirits, a spirit activity. And so we said, okay, we had a staff member stay with them until I think it was about 2 a.m. I believe it was maybe on a Friday evening. And they did recordings at various spots in the building. They spent some time on the balcony, in the main hall, the balcony, and in the steeple. No big surprise, perhaps. They got the most activity in the steeple. They did record what sounded to be a voice speaking. And in the balcony, they recorded what I heard or read was described as somebody dragging something very heavy across the balcony floor. And so a couple of things. One is that we also had when we had the exterior restoration work done, and I'm forgetting what year this was, but a few years ago, it was actually, I think, around that same time. So there was a lot of, we had people working, on the outside of the building, but also spending a lot of time up and down the stairs and in the steeple, because they were, working on the windows and things that needed access from both sides. And what I heard was that there was, I think it was maybe on a Friday, they worked during the, Monday through Friday kind of thing. And on a Friday, they were in the steeple preparing to do some of this work starting the following Monday. And in preparation, there were some items, I don't know what they were, that had been kind of lined on some kind of like on a windowsill or along the edge of the room. And they removed that, the workmen removed, the work people, I think they happen to be all men, but they removed these items so that they could be able to access that window, that area, first thing on Monday morning. And they were not pleased when they came back on Monday morning because somebody had put the things back. And apparently they expected that it was a member of the staff that had done this. And so they spoke to a member of the staff, and basically everybody said, why would we have done that? We don't just go hang out up there and clean up. So it seemed like the place had been cleaned up by somebody other than these people working on the building or a member of the staff. There was the voice thing. I did go up and hear a voice. Apparently, I reported it to my colleagues, and I hadn't at that point read this report that had come out of this recording session. They had read it. So I came down and I described to them what I heard, and they told me that the way I described it was exactly as it had been described in the report. So those are a few things. We also had, apparently there was a woman who claimed to have some connections with the departed, who was at some kind of an event and reported that she had a sense of a spirit in the main hall, but it wasn't a human. She reported it as some kind of a four-legged creature. So she felt it very strongly. And, you know, it's quite likely that during that time of the British occupation, when they had the riding school in, 1775, 1776, there were lots of horses in there. A horse met its end in the building. And, that's the only thing.
It just hasn't been able to find its way out.
Four-legged creatures can also include rodents, so who knows?
I don't know if I'd like it to be a horse more or much less.
I don't know.
Well, it's better than the ghost of a rat. I'm going for that.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you want to hear ghost stories from the old State House?
If you got them.
Well, I think there's stories, and I can't give the top secret information here because this would be recorded and it just can't get out in circulation. But when I've arrived at the old State House in 2011, just the year before, the staff, as part of a sort of after work kind of fun activity, had brought in a spirit medium to figure out if there were any spirits in the old State House. And much to everybody's chagrin, the medium did identify spirits, but they were not spirits of the Revolutionary period, which is what everyone wanted. Everyone at the old State House wants to have the ghost of James Otis, who went a little crazy in the 1760s and started throwing bricks. Like at once he threw a brick through every single window of the old State House because he was in what other people described as a mad freak, and was angry at the governor, and that was how he expressed it. So everyone wants, when there's a loud bang, they want it to be the ghost of James Otis, but no, the spirit medium identified that there was the presence of a mother and her 11-ish, 12-ish year old daughter, who, in communicating with them, so they were located up in the tower, and she was able to identify that they were related to one of the carpenters who had been involved with a restoration of the tower in the 1920s.
Wow.
So I don't know what to make of that. I don't know why they're there and why they chose that of all the places that their loved one had been as the place to reside. We haven't been able to puzzle that out, but maybe it has something to do with the fact that in a subsequent restoration, we located under the floorboards an erotic novel that somebody involved in that restoration in the 1920s had left there. 1920s vintage erotic novel, and it's now been accessioned into the collection. So I don't know what was going on there and why that led to spirits haunting the tower, but there you go. The story that's creepier, though, is our staff. There was one summer, I don't know if this is ongoing, but there's one summer where the staff who work at the admissions desk, multiple staff members reported having visitors come to them and say, "Oh, you should know that there's a girl down at the bottom of the rotunda. She looks like she's 11 or 12. She's wearing a white dress and she's looking for her parents." And then staff would go down and look for the girl, and there she was not to be found. And over many months, the same story was reported by different visitors with the same description of the same girl. So that story has taken hold among the staff as a thing. So I don't know if it's true or not, but there you go. That's our best ghost story.
Wow.
And some other time I can share the story of the cursed figurehead. There's also a cursed figurehead from the early 1800s in the collection.
I think before we ask our next question, Erica, there is a request for you to tell us what that voice sounded like.
Yeah.
Are you really capable of?
I can do that. I can definitely do that. Yeah. So I had gone up to the steeple to wind the bell and clock, which we were taking turns doing as a staff. You know, every Wednesday someone would go up and wind. So it was my turn to go up and wind, and I got up there, and I remember exactly where I was standing and like how it was, where I was looking. I was standing right behind where you stand to wind the clock mechanism, and looking just across. And I think I was just getting ready. I don't know if it was before or after I had done the winding or started it, but there was definitely a man's voice, very deep. And what it sounded like he was saying was, "Who?" And it was like, to me, it sounded like an owl. It definitely sounded like a human voice. The thing is that I read it as this is some kind of a spirit situation. That's how I read it. But I didn't feel afraid. I definitely didn't feel like I was in any kind of danger or compromised situation. I just felt like there was another presence there that was recognizing my presence. And ever since that time, every time I go up there, I always greet whoever happens to be there and say, "Hey, it's just me, it's Erica, remember me, I'm just here to help to, keep things in order, here to wind the bell on the clock," or whatever. Sometimes I give them a bow and I head out, just in case, to be respectful. But when I went downstairs and told my colleagues, I remember kind of like their jaws dropped, because I heard it as just like a human voice making the sound of an owl. But they said that when in the recording, apparently that what they recorded was this deep man's voice, and he was saying, "Who goes there?" So I just got the first part of that. That's what
Maybe
we
he liked you halfway through and he was like, "Oh no, I don't need to question it.
maybe,
Sure, it's fine."
perhaps. Anyway, I heard it once and that was it. But ever since then, just in case, I just kind of say hi.
Better
Those
safe
are
than sorry.
those are good words of wisdom for our members too, when they come and they're up in the balcony or they hear odd voices. Just identify yourself and say,
Yeah.
nothing to worry about.
That's right. I'm not rearranging things. I'm just winding.
So before we go on to our next question, I will say if anyone else wants to ask anything, feel free to pop it in the chat and we can make sure we get to those as well.
Yeah, I want to know if there are questions that the members have, so put them out there.
So one of my favorite things about both the Old State House and the Old South Meeting House, although that they are famous for kind of a very specific time period, they have really long and varied lives after that. Could you switch it up, Nat, if you wouldn't mind, maybe telling us about the most unusual next to life that the Old State House has?
Oh, sure. And I don't have a whole lot of detail about this, but so as some of you may know, the Old State House became the Old State House because the new State House was built and opened in the 1790s, and the newly independent Commonwealth of Massachusetts moved its government up to Beacon Hill, and nobody really knew what to do with the town, with the old State House. So it got turned into commercial space. And it spent a little bit of time being City Hall in the 1830s, but mostly in the first half of the 19th century, it was being used as office space for different businesses. And if you see photographs from the 19th century building, you can see like ticket sales or insurance people or hat merchants. But I particularly love the fact that somebody opened a fencing school. So there was a time during which you could go and learn the fine art of swordplay in Representatives Hall, where the future of the nation was once debated and decided. So that seems kind of strange, but there you have it.
That's very cool.
For me, I'd say during the period when the congregation of the Old South Church had decided to build the new Old South Church that still stands today in Copley Square and still is an active church, as probably most, if not all of you know, the Old South Church. So during that period, between 1872 and 1875, 1872, 1875, 76, the Old South was used as for somewhere between 1873 and 1875 was used as a post office. So it was, the U.S. Postal Service came in and they created little office cubicles inside the building. They built an extension on the corner, the corner of the building where we have the t-shirt stand or the fruit stand or whatever we still call it the fruit stand. But in that area, they built an extension, and they tore out a lot of what was on the inside, and they if you look at, I have a picture here, it's just they still seem to have, they kept the sounding board, but I think that's when they sold the pulpit in pieces, and it ended up being pieced back together later. But yeah, created all these little cubicles for postal workers to work inside the building.
It's a fine example of adaptive reuse of historic structures.
It was an adaptive reuse.
But taking all that apart and putting it back, I'm sure was a big challenge.
Yeah. That's something I actually haven't heard about, is what that process looked like and who did that. I mean, talk about workers and, who are the people who do this work? I mean, how is all that taken apart for the next stage? You can see when you look at this photo, which is in our architectural the book that's the architectural history of Old South. You know, like we see in some of those photos and you were referring to, Nat, at the old state house during the kind of commercial use period. We had those you know, signs for different companies lining the upper balcony inside Old South Meeting House as well. So yeah.
I feel like I can imagine the conversation where they talked about taking down the sounding board and someone looked at it and they were like, no.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah, we'll just leave
Right.
it.
How do we get up there?
Well, I'm very glad they didn't touch it because that is possibly my favorite bit of the building. So, we do have a question about maybe future events that look back towards the Revolutionary era. Do you see any ability to kind of walk around the space and maybe kind of visit that colonial revolutionary past? Is there a space that you would target for that?
Yeah, and looks like the question is specifically about walking tours, and we are right now, you know, one of the, you know, having launched as a new organization caring for both of these sites, one of the things that we're talking about is, you know, how do we, in the near term, integrate the visitor experience so that we can connect the stories of both sites together. So one of the easy ways to do that is to do some walking tours that begin at one building and go to the other. And there's also an opportunity to include some other points of interest in the neighborhood as part of that walking tour. So we're looking at that right now, looking at, you know, one theme that was of interest was exploring the sort of origins of the First Amendment and thinking about how both buildings are involved in the history of free speech. There's also been talk about how can you link the story of particular events. The Boston Massacre is on our minds this year because of the 250th anniversary, and the memory of those events in these places over time. So I think we were thinking about building a tour that does something along those lines. But I think there's a lot of other opportunities in the area. The trick, I think, in doing this is limiting it. So there's just a few points of interest. Back in, I don't know, whenever it was, 2016, when we did that play, Blood on the Snow, at the old State House that's about the Boston Massacre, there was one day where the playwright and I did a, like, let's go and look at all the sites that are about the thing that you see in the play. And, you know, we were like, oh, we'll go here, there, and the other place. And we had a 3-hour walking tour before the play. And so the poor people who came with us on that walking tour ended up being so exhausted. I'm not sure they could quite enjoy the play that night. But yes, I think it's a good suggestion, and it's fun to put something together like that gives people a glimpse of the little known nuggets.
Mm-hmm. So we are just about going to be finishing up soon. I do have one last quick question. And this is kind of a personal curiosity for me. I think one of the underrated parts of this merger process for staff has been learning a lot about an entirely new historic site. It's awesome to work in one, and getting to work in two has been really cool. What are some maybe connections between either the Boston Society or the Old State House and Old South that maybe you didn't know about, or you learned a new kind of level to that connection during the past year or so? And Erica, do you have anything that comes to you for that?
I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is actually something that I have learned little bits of, kind of nuggets of, over the past several years that I feel like I haven't necessarily learned a whole lot more about recently, but I am excited to learn more about. And that's kind of the connection points between the two kind of preservation stories between the two buildings, especially during that period of the late 19th century. And just kind of, you know, because I've studied up on the story of the Old South, and I've learned bits and pieces of the Old State House story, but I'd like to learn more and explore more about how those two, maybe like the people that were involved in kind of, where there might be overlaps between not just kind of the overarching stories, but the people and the processes that went into the decisions and the strategies for preventing both of the buildings from being destroyed.
Yeah, I agree with you. Exploring all of those connections in the preservation stories is it's really interesting. I think we learn a lot about the preservation stories we had been telling independently by putting them together and seeing them as part of one larger whole. And I think that's true of so many aspects of the stories that the buildings contain. I mean, what drove the merger, as I think was the desire to be able to tell the larger story that each building holds a part of around the Revolutionary period, because there's so many events where the things that were happening in Old South Meeting House were directly in dialogue with the things happening in the townhouse, and you can understand both better by telling them as part of one story. I'm also really interested in exploring the connections between those who are the members of the congregation at Old South and the membership of the council and the House of Representatives that met down at the townhouse. But once we started talking about these connections, it was just, things are hiding in plain sight, right? So I had done a bunch of research on these there's ox eye windows on the tower of the old State House, and there are keystones on each of those that are ornately carved, and they were done by a carver, a stone carver, who was best known for doing the death's head on early 18th century gravestones. And when I looked at the story of the building of Old South Meeting House, it turns out he was actually the person who did the masonry on the foundation. He helped lay the foundation for Old South Meeting House. So that's a pretty cool story. I have a lot of more work to do to piece that together and be able to tell that. Like, I can't even remember the name of the guy at this point because I did the research a while ago and made the connection a while ago. And I can't get access to my notes, so I couldn't go and read up on it. But other things too, like walking to and from the train station each day. I used to stare at this plaque that talks about where the Great Fire of 1872 was stopped, and of course, the town poured resources into stopping it before it reached Old South Meeting House, and marking the spot where they succeeded is a giant brass plaque that was put up by the Bostonian Society. So all those connections have been there all this time, and it's great that we can now formalize them through this merger.
Well, thank you both for sharing your knowledge with us, and thank you to all of our members for spending some time with us today. It's been wonderful to kind of learn with you guys about this new kind of shared history of the organization. And thank you for being members right now. Your support is incredibly, incredibly inspiring to us. And as you can see, you can keep up to date with all the other work that we're doing on our various social media channels. So thanks for hanging out with us this afternoon. And as always, stay safe. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.